God, open our eyes to see you, our ears to hear you, our minds to know you, our hands to serve you, and our hearts to love you. Amen. It was a cool fall day, loud and noisy, people all dressed up. Two people saw each other in the crowd and shared a warm 5-second handshake. One took a second hand to pat their exchange, solidifying their connection and trust in that moment. God looked down at this simple moment of sibling exchange and for a moment smiled, proud of his two children for remembering that they are sister and brother. I hope all of us can look for opportunities for these exchanges in the next few weeks as this election season comes to a crescendo. But today's gospel from Hebrews couldn't be more timely as it reminds us that God alone holds permanent authority. Listen to that again. God alone holds permanent authority. Not Kamala Harris, not Donald Trump, not you or me, God alone. Hebrews also says that Jesus always lives to intercede for us. And how fortunate we are to have an intercessor, an advocate for our hopes and dreams, our thoughts and feelings, our minds and hearts in Jesus. Hebrews 7 speaks to the eternal power of Jesus, contrasting him with the temporary and flawed priesthoods. It's the same as today, except that we call the priesthoods presidents. Whether it's Kamala or Donald, the next president will last a maximum of 4 or 8 years. While they may hold power for a short time, their influence will eventually fade, while God's kingdom will endure longer than any of us. Hebrews reminds us that our allegiance is to something higher, something eternal, and that while political victories come and go, Christ has already won everything. There is no nail-biting Tuesday night scrolling through the TV to see the fate of our future, not with Christ. And that's what being a Christian is all about. It's what sitting here this morning is all about. We are present to say that we will not be dejected at the things of the world, that we will not let hate tear us down, that we will stand strong in love regardless of what happens out there in the world, because we recognize we belong to the victor. Hate and division was triumphed 2,024 years ago when a beaten-up Christ walked the road to Calvary. Political leaders come and go, but what about our church? Are we meant to fade? We as a church are called to build something that will endure and far outpace the terms of either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Where will we be in 4 years? Will we be caught up in the whirlwind of political strife? Or will we have built this church to ensure that it remains a light for generations to come? We cannot advocate for social justice while ignoring the disconnection our young people feel towards our institution. They are symbiotic. The Rorschach inkblot test, named after Swiss psychologist Hermann Rorschach, was developed in the early 20th century as a tool to explore how individuals interpret ambiguous images. Rorschach initially used these inkblots to assess personality traits and emotional functioning, focusing on areas like perception and imagination. His goal wasn't to create a definitive diagnosis, but to reveal underlying feelings, fears, and desires that people might be unaware of them in themselves. Before Rorschach's tests, psychologists had few tools to understand the way personal biases and projections clouded perception. People tend to see themselves in the world around them. often unconsciously imposing their fears or hopes onto objects or situations. So this is why the Rorschach test remains so powerful. It highlights how we might project our inner emotions onto things that don't necessarily fully embody them. Just like the ink blots, political figures can serve as mirrors, reflecting back whatever emotions and judgments we bring with us. And when we look at leaders like Trump or Harris, the intense anger or admiration we feel often says more about our own experiences, expectations, or anxieties than about these human beings themselves. The Rorschach test reminds us that what we see isn't always a complete objective truth. It's often a projection. By focusing first on Christ, we allow God to clarify our vision instead of viewing leaders through the lenses clouded by our own biases. We can seek God's perspective, recognizing the humanity in those we disagree with, and keeping our focus on the eternal truth of His kingdom. Have you ever taken a Rorschach test? I have. It's very fascinating. You're shown a series of abstract ink blocks and asked to interpret them. The image doesn't actually mean anything specific. It's all about what we project onto them. When you think of Trump or Kamala, are you filled with strong emotion, such strong emotions that you can barely breathe? I promise you, God does not want that for you. We project our deepest hopes, fears, and frustrations onto these individuals. But the truth is, they are human, just like us, limited by the constraints of their role and the reality that they too will fade from the spotlight. For some, one might represent hope and almost an idealization, while the other might represent fear, anger, and hate. But is this fair? Are we looking at these leaders as they really are? Is it okay to judge somebody so fervently and to conclude an unwavering judgment about someone which you do not know, and the only thing you know about is what you see on screens? Hebrews reminds us that only Christ, who intercedes eternally, has the authority to shape our souls and our lives. Yet we often give human beings, whether they're political leaders or other people, the ability to control our lives and our emotions. Instead of letting human beings take the place of God, what if we saw the truth? That they are temporary, imperfect, doing their best or their worst, but still human. When we get consumed with anger toward a political figure, it's worth asking, is this anger coming from God? Are these feelings coming from God? Does it have to be anger? Or is it a sign that we are letting something outside God's presence disturb our hearts? In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus says, the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. Only after that does he instruct us to love our neighbor, and that order matters. We often reverse it, thinking that we are serving God only by our efforts to love our neighbor, whether that's through relationship, kindness, politics, or activism. But if our focus is not on God first, then we miss what it's all about. Being politically active is not what it's all about. Being kind is not what it's all about. It's about first thinking of God and then doing those things second and third. When we try to force change or control outcomes without seeking God's guidance first, we're operating outside his arms, and that's where anger and fear and worry perseverate. These emotions can take over because we're acting from a place of our own will, not God's peace. And in this way, the intensity of our feelings are not so intense because if we give God a great big hug first. God will hold us every day through every conversation, politically charged or not, but we have to let him. We have to choose to wake up and hug him every day, just as we do our spouse as they go out the door for work or our children to school. We have to do that with God. We are called to love God first, and that includes surrendering our anger and our judgment and our need to control. Instead of projecting our inner turmoils onto earthly figures, what if we asked God to reveal what these emotions mean? What deeper fear or frustrations are they pointing to, and how can God heal them within us? Wherever I am and wherever you are, I hope St. Michael's in 4 years will be a church that isn't defined just by political involvement, but continues to be defined by their deep, unwavering love of God. Because as we all know, this isn't like any other organization. We don't serve a boss or a CEO or a president or a society. We serve God. And so if we don't begin every conversation with a prayer, if we don't start every day with God, we are simply destined by design to fail. I hope St. Michael's can work to create a space where the next generation finds a home, not because we fought the right political battles, but because we loved, served, and put God above all else. It was a cool fall day, loud and noisy. People all dressed up. 2 people saw each other in the crowd and shared a warm 5-second handshake. One took a second hand to pat their exchange, solidifying their connection and trust in that moment. God looked down at this simple moment of sibling exchange, and for a moment he was proud of his 2 children, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, for remembering that they are sister and brother. Amen.